Good evening, attorney and classmates. I would like to report tonight the case assigned to me. This is a 2021 case. The case is entitled Department of Finance, represented by its secretary, and the Bureau of Internal Revenue, represented by its commissioner, versus Asia United Bank et al. There are so many respondents in this case. So I have digested this case. And at the outset, I would like to reiterate what the Supreme Court emphasized in this case. This is the cream of the crop of the case. The Supreme Court said that while the taxes are the lifeblood of the government, the court will not hesitate to strike down the invalid administrative issuances which unduly override the law to be implemented. This is actually a case, although a tax case, but it has a relation to a constitutional law doctrine wherein this is a classic example of a violation of the principle of delegation of authority by the Congress to an administrative agency. The administrative agency is only required to fill in the gaps and to fill in the details or the gaps of the law, but the administrative agency is not allowed to add, modify, or alter the law, the legislative intent in this case. So the facts of the case, the case started when the petitioner DOF, for short for Department of Finance, through the SOF or the Secretary of Finance, issued the revenue regulation on March 15, 2011. Okay, so the said revenue regulation provides that a bank may deduct only those costs and expenses attributable to the operation of its regular banking units, or the RBU for short, to arrive at a taxable income of the RBU subject to regular income tax. That any cost or expense related with or incurred for the operation of its foreign currency deposit or offshore banking unit are not allowed as deductions from the RBU's taxable income. So respondents AUB et al. Therefore filed a petition for declaratory relief with TRO and writ of preliminary injunction. They argued that the said revenue regulation was issued, number one, it was issued without any basis in the tax code, and it expands the allocation of costs and expenses under Section 50 of the tax code, and it contravenes Section 43. So these are the arguments that this revenue regulation, number one, is contradictory to Section 50 of the tax code and Section 43 of the tax code. So number 4, it unduly limits their rights to claim deductions specifically granted also by the tax code, that it is oppressive and unreasonable, which effectively amount to deprivation of property without due process of law. It was issued without prior consultation with persons affected. Last, that it violates the Equal Protection Clause, that the requirement upon the banks and other financial institutions to adopt the prescribed allocation method under the said revenue regulation. Now, in this case, the RTC granted the application, and the RTC declared that the said revenue regulation was null and void for being beyond the authority of the Secretary of Finance and the CIR. So, what are the issues of the case that reached the Supreme Court? The issues of the case are, number one, pertains to jurisdiction, whether or not the RTC had jurisdiction over the petition. The second is about the substantive issue, which is whether or not the revenue regulation is valid. So, as regards the first issue, the Supreme Court said here that the RTC has no jurisdiction over the case, citing the 2021 case of St. Mary's Academy of Caloocan City versus Inares. The Supreme Court said that it is the Court of Tax Appeals, it is the CTA and not the RTC that has the jurisdiction
to rule on the constitutionality and validity of the revenue issuances by the CIR, and that it is not the prevailing rule. So in this particular case, the Supreme Court said that the RTC has no jurisdiction. The Supreme Court ruled that the Court of Tax Appeal has jurisdiction in this particular case pertaining to revenue regulation. So thus, the RTC should not have acted upon the petition and should have dismissed the same for lack of jurisdiction. Consequently, the RTC's order declaring Revenue Regulation 4-2021 as invalid is void because wala nga siyang jurisdiction to declare it as void. It is the Court of Tax Appeal. As pertain to the second issue, whether or not the said revenue regulation is invalid, the Supreme Court said that the said revenue regulation is invalid, defective, and ineffectual. So the heart of the matter in this case is that the Supreme Court said that the BIR unduly expanded or modified. So kaya what I have told you earlier is that they said basta the power of an administrative agency is only delegated by the Congress. And if that is delegated, the administrative agency cannot expand the law that it is supposed to fill in. The role of the administrative agency is just only to fill in the details or the gaps, but it cannot make the revenue regulation as though it is making a new law, or it is expanding, or it is modifying the provisions of the law that is passed by the Congress. So that is what happened in this case. The Supreme Court said that your revenue regulation, it expanded the tax code. It expanded some of the provisions or modified some of the provisions of the tax code, particularly Section 43 and Section 34 and Section 50. So the Supreme Court said that it unduly expanded or modified Section 43 of the tax code by curtailing the income tax deductions of respondents and by sanctioning the method of accounting the respondents should use without any basis found in the tax code. Yan. So further, it also violates Section 50 of the tax code since there is no showing that Revenue Regulation 4-2021 was issued to prevent evasion of taxes, nor to clearly reflect the income controlled by the taxpayer's organization, trade, or business. Furthermore, again, it unduly modifies or expanded or violates Section 34 of the tax code. The Supreme Court ratiocinated that the permissible deductions under Section 34A(1) or of the tax code were effectively modified, limited, and qualified by revenue regulation. Kumbaga, the tax code gives us freedom, but in your revenue regulation or the tax code, Section 34 gives us leeway. Section 43 gives us the option to use a method of accounting, but when you pass the revenue regulation, it restricts us. So parang masumubra pa yung revenue regulation nyo kaysa sa law. So this principle of delegation of authority, parang ito yung adage natin na the water cannot rise above its source. So hindi pwede na ang tubig ay lalagpas pa or susobra pa kaysa sa source. The source will always be higher than the water flowing down. So the law will always be higher than the revenue regulation because the life that gives breath to the revenue regulation is the law. So the revenue regulation cannot contradict the law. So this is what happened in this particular case. Okay, so since the same are being deducted or allocated to tax-exempt or final tax-paid income in violation of the law and prevailing jurisprudence. Now, all told, the Supreme Court said that said revenue regulation did not simply provide the details for the enforcement of the provisions of the tax code, neither did it interpret the provisions of the tax code. This act of BIR and the CIR amounts to tax legislation. Yun, parang yung revenue regulation, parang nag-legislate sila it amounts, or the revenue regulation becomes or tantamounts to a law. This is what happened in the case, which should not be. It should only fill in the details, fill in the gaps, specify the some of the provisions of the tax code, but it should not alter the tax code itself. Okay, so therefore the Supreme Court said that the making of its issuance becomes, or the revenue regulation is an ultra vires act on the part of the Secretary of Finance. So moreover, it was issued in violation also of the due process requirements, because the requirements of notice, hearing, and publication were not strictly observed. Ito pa, violation pa ng due process. So ito yung sabi ng Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the respondent banks on the basis of substantive and procedural irregularities in the issuance of the Revenue Regulation 4-2011. So thus, the Supreme Court said that the IRR, or the implementing rules and regulation of a law, cannot extend the law or expand its coverage, as the power to amend or repeal a statute is vested in the legislature. The revenue regulation by the administrative agency has its own limit. So that's all for my report. I hope you have learned something. Thank you and God bless.